The ballroom was alive with soft murmurs, the sound of silk brushing against the polished floor, the glint of crystal glasses catching the light. A gathering of the most prestigious families in the kingdom. All eyes turned to the Duke as he strode into the room, his presence commanding the attention of every person in it. He was a man used to power, a man who had never known the sting of rejection. But his gaze, cold and calculating, swept across the sea of noble women, his expression unreadable, his pace slow but deliberate. The ladies, their hearts racing, each hoped to catch his eye. Each one thought she was the chosen one, but not one of them was. The Duke moved past them all, ignoring them like they were mere shadows in his path, until he reached the farthest corner of the room. Eleanor stood there, hidden in plain sight, out of place among the glittering jewels and luxurious fabrics. Her dress was simple, worn at the edges, the color faded, and the seams slightly crooked. She had no hope of being noticed, no expectation that tonight would be any different from the countless others where she had been nothing but a background figure. Her family, wealthy once but now on the edge of ruin, had brought her here as nothing more than a servant, a girl to help with the trivial matters of the evening, like fetching refreshments and tidying up forgotten corners. Her presence was invisible to everyone but the walls, which stood as silent witnesses to her quiet misery. She wasn't meant to be seen. She wasn't meant to be remembered. But then, in the middle of the grand hall, everything stopped. The sound of the orchestra playing faded, the laughter of the guests softened to a distant hum. The Duke's eyes, icy and piercing, landed on her. For a moment, time froze. There was no longer any noise in the room, no clinking of glasses, no soft murmur of the aristocracy. All that existed was the space between them, the sharpness of his gaze as he locked eyes with her, and the fluttering of her heart, which she couldn't control. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. It was as if the room had been suspended in midair, each moment lingering longer than it should. Then, without a word, the Duke took a single step toward her. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, each one resonating with power, with authority. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, feel the weight of their expectations, their judgments, their whispers. The Duke never looked away from her. He didn't pause to consider the others in the room. His focus was entirely on her. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the shadows where she belonged, but her feet remained glued to the floor. There was no escaping the inevitable. His voice, when it came, was calm, devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 decisions. Her, he said, simply. The words sliced through the silence like a blade. The room erupted in gasps. It was as if the very air had been ripped apart. Whispers began, frantic and confused, but Eleanor didn't hear them. She was frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. The Duke had chosen her. Of all the women in the room, he had chosen the one who didn't belong, the one who had never been seen, the one who had always been dismissed as invisible. The moment felt unreal, like a dream she was too terrified to wake from. She had no idea what this meant, what he saw in her, or why he would make such a choice. But before she could think further, the Duke's hand was at her arm, gently but firmly pulling her forward. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through her body that she could neither understand nor deny. As he guided her through the crowd, she noticed the shocked faces of the women who had once been her betters, the envy and disbelief in their eyes. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. And yet, she was no longer just Eleanor, the forgotten daughter of a once wealthy family. She was the Duke's choice. The crowd parted as she walked beside him, their whispers following them like a dark cloud. But she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was seen. For the first time in her life, she mattered. And that moment, when the Duke had chosen her, would change everything. The Duke's hand was still at Eleanor's arm, guiding her through the sea of astonished faces. Her heart pounded in her chest as every step she took felt heavier, more deliberate. The whispers followed her like a shadow, but she couldn't focus on them. All that mattered was the firm, unyielding grip of the Duke's hand on her elbow. She had never been this close to a man of such power, and even though his touch was gentle, there was something commanding in it, something that told her she wasn't just being led, she was being claimed. The ballroom stretched out before her, an ocean of glistening chandeliers and velvet drapes, and she was the center of it all. As they moved forward, The crowd parted without question, their gazes fixed not on the Duke, but on her, the girl who had never mattered, who had always been invisible. She could feel the weight of their eyes, their judgment, but strangely, it didn't crush her. It made her feel something else. Alive. As they reached the center of the room, the Duke stopped, and the silence that fell was suffocating. He didn't speak, not yet, but the way he held her, just the slightest pressure on her arm, was enough to make her heart race even faster. The eyes of the room were still on them, but now, it wasn't just a glance. It was a gaze that lingered, that demanded attention. The tension was unbearable. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. She had never been the center of such scrutiny. She had never been important enough to be looked at with anything but disdain. But now, she stood before the most powerful man in the room, and his gaze was fixed on her, steady, unwavering. He was waiting for something, but she wasn't sure what. It was as if the air itself had thickened around them, as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but there was also something exhilarating about it. She had no idea what he saw in her, why he had chosen her. Was it pity, curiosity, or something else entirely? Her breath caught in her throat as the Duke slowly released his grip on her arm, his fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. He stepped back, but only slightly, just enough to give her space to breathe, to think, but it only made the tension between them grow. The silence stretched on, unbroken, until the Duke finally spoke. His voice was low, smooth, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "This is not a place for the weak," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. Eleanor's pulse quickened, her eyes widening. She wasn't sure if he was speaking to her, or to the room, or to both. But in that moment, something shifted. The way the Duke spoke wasn't just a declaration. It was a command. She could feel it in her bones, the weight of his words, the authority behind them. She wasn't sure if she was meant to answer, to speak, or to remain silent, but all she could do was nod, almost involuntarily. The Duke's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, and for a split second, she thought she saw something else, something fleeting, beneath his icy exterior. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "You may have thought this was your place," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "but I will show you what it truly means to belong." His words hung in the air like a challenge, a promise, or perhaps a threat. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She was trapped in this moment, trapped in the weight of his gaze, and somehow, she didn't want to be anywhere else. For the first time in her life, she felt as if she were on the verge of something bigger than herself, something dangerous. She didn't know where this was going, but she was terrified to find out. The Duke's hand moved to his side, and with a sharp motion, he gestured for her to follow him. It wasn't a question, it was an order. And though Eleanor wanted to hesitate, to rebel, she found herself stepping forward, her legs moving of their own accord. The crowd shifted behind them, as if parting to make way for their march. There was no turning back now. She was in his world now, and the rules were different. She didn't know what he wanted from her, or why he had chosen her, but the one thing she did know was that this moment, this strange, surreal moment, was just the beginning. The Duke's hand remained on her elbow as they walked through the crowded ballroom, his touch firm yet calculated, guiding her with a quiet dominance. Eleanor felt the heat of his presence at her side, every step they took echoing through the vast, opulent room. The whispers that had followed them from the moment he chose her intensified, swirling around them like a storm. She could hear their mutters, their disbelief, but she didn't dare look at anyone else. All she could do was focus on him, on the weight of his gaze, on the subtle pressure of his hand, the constant reminder that this moment had been chosen for her, whether she wanted it or not. The Duke's eyes never wavered from her. His sharp, calculating gaze was steady, as though he were appraising her, testing her resolve. He hadn't spoken a word since his declaration, and Eleanor wasn't sure if she should say something, anything. But she knew better than to speak. Her silence was her only defense, her only way to remain unnoticed, to not make a fool of herself in front of the most powerful man in the room. They stopped in front of the grand staircase, the center of the ballroom now nothing but a blur around her. The Duke turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but his presence overwhelming. The people around them fell away, parting like the Red Sea as he moved, as if his every movement had the power to make the world bend to his will. Eleanor stood before him, feeling small, insignificant. She had never been this close to someone who commanded such power, someone who had the ability to make or break reputations with a single word. His gaze softened ever so slightly, but only for a fleeting moment, before he spoke. "You will learn quickly," he said, his voice low, almost too soft, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. She had no idea what he meant, what he expected from her, but she could feel the weight of his words pressing against her chest. The Duke took a step closer, the air between them crackling with tension. His hand slid from her elbow to her wrist, a gentle yet firm grip that left her breathless. The room seemed to hold its breath as well, watching the interaction with bated silence. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening. She wanted to pull away, to escape, but she couldn't. She was trapped in this moment, trapped in his gaze, in the space between them. "You're not what they think you are," the Duke continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "You'll soon see what you're truly capable of." His words were a challenge, a statement, and Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, her hands trembling at her sides, but she didn't move, didn't dare to speak. The Duke's gaze was unyielding, unwavering. He wasn't looking at her with kindness, with sympathy, but with something else, something colder, more calculating. Eleanor couldn't tell if he was testing her or if he was simply making her aware of her place in this world. She didn't know which one terrified her more. The Duke took another step closer, closing the gap between them, and for the briefest of moments, Eleanor thought he might say something more, something that would give her a clue as to what he wanted from her. But he didn't. Instead, he turned away from her with a swift motion, his cape swishing behind him. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice now sharp, carrying the weight of his authority. Eleanor felt her chest tighten as she followed him, the weight of his command pressing down on her. They moved through the ballroom together, her every step a reflection of his power, his presence. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, on them both, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension between them was palpable, like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. She could feel the power shift, the delicate dance of dominance and submission, and she wasn't sure where she fit in this world. All she knew was that the Duke had chosen her, and that decision, that moment, would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Duke's presence was like a storm cloud hanging over Eleanor as they moved deeper into the heart of the ballroom. The whispers intensified, the tension palpable. She could feel the eyes of the guests burning into her, their curiosity, their disbelief. Her every step seemed to echo louder than the music that filled the room, and, for the first time in her life, she was more than just a shadow in the corner. She was seen. The Duke, ever calm, walked with purpose, his figure towering beside her, his movements deliberate. He didn't glance at the others, didn't pause to acknowledge the whispers. All that mattered was her. She couldn't explain it. She didn't know why he had chosen her, why he had rejected every other woman in the room. But one thing was clear, her place had changed. The power dynamic had shifted. She could feel it with every step she took beside him. As they reached the center of the ballroom, the murmurs died down. The crowd parted, their gazes heavy with judgment, envy, and curiosity. Eleanor felt exposed, vulnerable, but there was something else too. Something that tasted like Power Star. The Duke stopped, and she did too, her breath catching in her throat. She was now the focus of the entire room. Every eye, every whisper, every gaze fixed on her. She could feel their silent judgment, the scrutiny of 1,000 aristocrats. And yet, as she stood there, beside the Duke, a strange confidence began to stir inside her. He didn't look at her, but the air around them crackled with a silent tension, as though his every movement commanded the room. A hush fell. The Duke finally turned to face her. The moment stretched out in an almost painful silence. His gaze met hers, piercing, calculating. There was no warmth, no kindness. His eyes were cold, but there was an intensity there that made her heart race. For a moment, she could barely breathe. "You have no idea what this means," the Duke said softly, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Eleanor's throat went dry. She didn't know what he meant, but she could feel the weight of his command, the pressure of his authority. She was standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite grasp, something that terrified her and excited her in equal measure. The people around them were silent now, waiting for the next move, but the Duke didn't give them anything. He didn't even look at them. He turned to her again, his expression unreadable. And then, with a single, sharp motion, he took her hand. The movement was swift, firm, and the touch was electric. Eleanor's body froze, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The Duke didn't say a word, but the act of taking her hand was a declaration. It was a shift in the power dynamic, a bold claim that no one in the room could ignore. His touch was a mark of ownership, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that made her feel as though she was the center of his world. The tension in the room was almost unbearable now. The other women in the ballroom stared at her, some with envy, others with disdain, but none with the same level of attention that the Duke gave her. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, their silent judgment, but it no longer mattered. She was his choice. She was no longer invisible. The room seemed to blur as the Duke led her across the floor, his grip never wavering. Every step they took was deliberate, each one reinforcing the shift in power that had just occurred. The murmurs resumed, but they no longer held the same weight. The silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps, and Eleanor couldn't help but notice the way the crowd parted before them. They moved through the ballroom like a force of nature, unchallenged, unstoppable. The Duke was a man who commanded the world around him, and in that moment, so was she. They reached the grand staircase, and as the Duke paused, he turned to her again, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but it carried a promise that she couldn't ignore. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know how to navigate this new world, this new reality. But one thing was certain. Her life had changed in that single moment. The power had shifted, and she was no longer a mere spectator in the world of the powerful. She was part of it now. The Duke's grip on her hand was unrelenting as they moved deeper into the ballroom, the crowd parting before them like a river in flood. Eleanor's heart raced with every step, every whisper that followed them. The room felt both too large and too small at the same time, her body taut, with the weight of 1,000 gazes, but the Duke, unbothered by the eyes that followed, never once faltered. His presence was a storm, and she, though caught in its center, felt the subtle pull of something she couldn't name, a power that was as much hers as it was his, though she had no idea how to wield it. They reached the center of the ballroom, and the music, which had once been the backdrop to the guests' idle chatter, slowed, almost imperceptibly, as the Duke stopped in front of her. His gaze never left hers, cold, calculating, but with something else, something almost unreadable, in the depths of his eyes. The people around them remained silent, watching, waiting. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible thread pulling tighter and tighter. Eleanor felt the air around them thicken, the heat of his proximity pressing in on her like a physical force. Her breath caught as the Duke took another step closer, the distance between them shrinking with every passing second, until she could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his presence was enough. "You've been invisible to them," he said, his voice low, almost too quiet for anyone to hear. But in the silence of the ballroom, it felt as though the words had been spoken aloud for everyone to hear. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat dry. The Duke's words were not a question, not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. He was not asking for confirmation. He was simply observing. And yet, she felt the weight of his observation like a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders. She was not invisible now. Now, she stood at the center of his world. The room was still, but in her mind, she could hear the whispers, the murmurs of the guests who were watching her every move, trying to understand what had just happened. The Duke had chosen her, and that choice had shattered the carefully crafted facade of the evening. But why? Eleanor had no answer. The moment felt unreal, as if the ground beneath her feet had been pulled away. And yet, she couldn't look away from him. "You're not like them," the Duke continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't belong in their world, and yet." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as though calculating the next move in a game he had already won. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to speak, to ask what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. She was afraid that anything she said would break the delicate tension between them, would make this moment slip away before she had a chance to grasp it. The Duke, seeming to sense her hesitation, took her hand once more, but this time, it was a pull, a firm, deliberate motion that sent a jolt of energy through her. She felt the room spin as he guided her through the sea of onlookers, their eyes trained on them, their curiosity a tangible thing. But she didn't look at them. Her gaze was fixed on the Duke, on the way his jaw was set, on the slight narrowing of his eyes, on the way he moved with purpose, as if the world itself were bending to his will. She could feel the weight of his power pressing on her chest, on her heart, but strangely, it wasn't suffocating. It was thrilling. Every step they took felt like a challenge to the world around them, a reminder that he, could do whatever he wanted. And she, though caught in the whirlwind, found herself responding to him, her body moving in sync with his, following his lead without question. As they passed through the ballroom, Eleanor saw the faces of the women who had once been the center of attention, the women who had been vying for the Duke's favor. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief and anger, but there was no mistaking the envy in their eyes. They knew that the Duke had chosen her, and that alone was enough to set her apart. She was no longer invisible. She was a force to be reckoned with. The Duke stopped at the far side of the ballroom, where a private alcove awaited them. The guests had begun to murmur again, but Eleanor couldn't hear them. She could only hear the Duke's steady breath, could only feel the pulse of his presence. As they entered the alcove, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with the weight of unspoken words, with the unvoiced tension that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. But finally, the Duke broke the silence. "You'll learn what it means to truly belong," he said, his voice low, almost tender, though there was an edge to it. Eleanor felt her breath catch again. What did he mean by that? What was he asking of her? But she didn't ask. She couldn't. She was too afraid of the answer. Instead, she stood there, caught in his gaze, unsure of what would come next, but knowing, deep down, that everything had already changed. The Duke's presence loomed over Eleanor like a storm cloud, and as they stood in the alcove, the tension between them seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The guests were still murmuring, their eyes flicking toward the corner of the ballroom, where she stood with him. The whispers had become more intense, more insistent. They didn't understand. They couldn't. The Duke had chosen her, and that in itself was enough to make her feel as though she had just stepped into a different world, one where she didn't belong but somehow was the center of attention. The room had become a distant echo, as if the world outside this moment had ceased to exist. The Duke's gaze never wavered from her. He studied her with a quiet intensity that made her heart race. She could feel his eyes moving over her, appraising her, as though she were a possession to be examined. But there was something in his gaze, something that made her feel seen, noticed. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being tested. Every inch of her was on edge. The air around them was charged, each movement, each subtle shift in the Duke's posture, sending waves of tension through her body. He didn't touch her again, not yet, but the space between them felt electric. The Duke took a small step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. Eleanor could feel the pull of his presence, the force of it, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of it. He stopped just inches away from her. "Do you understand your place here?" he asked, his voice low, calm, but with a weight that made her skin prickle. Eleanor swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. She wasn't sure what he meant. Was this another test? Was he asking her if she understood that she was no longer invisible? Or was there something else he expected from her? She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The Duke watched her, his gaze unwavering, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought he might move away, that he might let the silence stretch into something more comfortable. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against her arm as he moved to stand beside her. The touch was brief, but it sent a shock wave through her body, and her breath caught in her chest. The room seemed to stop, the whispers silenced for just a fraction of a second. "You are not like the others," the Duke said, his voice barely above a whisper. They expect you to fall in line. But you won't. Not like them. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She could feel the weight of his words sinking into her, filling her with a strange sense of purpose, of power, and yet, she was still lost. She still didn't know what he wanted from her. What did he see in her? Why had he chosen her? The tension between them was unbearable. She could feel the anticipation building, the quiet understanding that something was about to happen, but she didn't know what. The Duke moved again, his steps deliberate and slow, but with purpose. He walked around her, his gaze never leaving her, as if studying her, as if deciding. Eleanor could feel his presence behind her, his every movement sending a ripple through the air. She was acutely aware of how small she felt in comparison to him. He was a force, an immovable object that commanded the room with his every gesture. And yet, as he circled her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was something more than just a pawn in his game. There was power in this moment, power that came from his attention, but also from something else. Eleanor had always been invisible, until now. The Duke stopped in front of her once more, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to fade away again, leaving only the two of them in the center of it all. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You will learn," the Duke said finally, his voice sharp, his words deliberate. "You will learn what it means to be chosen." His eyes softened just a fraction, but the intensity behind them didn't change. Eleanor's chest tightened. She had no idea what he meant, but she could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. Chosen. The word echoed in her mind, leaving her dizzy, unsure of what she had just stepped into. She could feel the eyes of the guests on her, but they didn't matter. Not now. All that mattered was the Duke and the strange, powerful pull between them. The room was still silent, the anticipation building with every passing second. But Eleanor didn't know if she was ready for whatever came next. She didn't know if she was ready to understand the true meaning of being chosen. The Duke reached out, his hand gently cupping her chin, lifting her face to meet his. The touch was firm, possessive, but not unkind. Eleanor's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment stretched out, frozen in time, as if the whole world had paused just for them. His eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, Eleanor understood. She wasn't just standing before him. She was standing with him. And in that understanding, everything began to change. The tension, the uncertainty, the fear, all of it was there, but so was something else. Something deeper. The Duke hadn't just chosen her. He had claimed her. The tension in the ballroom grew with each passing moment. The Duke stood beside Eleanor, his presence as commanding as ever, the space around them seemingly shrinking under the weight of unspoken expectations. The room buzzed with nervous whispers, but none dared to approach them. It was as though the very air had become thick with power, with fear, with something Eleanor could not name, but could feel pulsing in her chest. The Duke, his gaze unwavering, slowly began to guide her through the crowd again. His touch, firm yet still gentle, remained at the small of her back, pushing her forward, guiding her through the sea of nobles who parted before them like a wave retreating from the shore. Eleanor's heart beat loudly in her chest. As they moved, the rhythm of it matching the pounding of her feet against the floor. The music played on, but it felt distant now, almost unreal. The only sound she could hear was the steady thrum of her pulse, the quiet whisper of her gown as it swished against the floor, and the Duke's steady breath beside her. She tried to focus, to push back the overwhelming sensation of being watched, of being judged. Every eye in the room was on her. She could feel their gazes like fingers tracing her skin, measuring her, calculating her every move. They were waiting for her to falter. They were waiting for her to fail. But Eleanor couldn't. Not now. Not when everything had already changed. The Duke stopped again, pulling her to a halt. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the silent judgment of the room, but she could feel the subtle shift in his stance. His eyes, cold and calculating, never left hers. He was studying her, and in that moment, she felt seen more than she ever had before. But the feeling was more than just that. It was overwhelming. It was suffocating. She had always been invisible, had always been the one who stood at the edges, watching, waiting. But now, she was the center of attention, the one everyone was watching, the one whose every breath seemed to matter. The Duke's hand moved from her back to her wrist, his fingers wrapping around it with gentle authority, guiding her body closer to his. She could feel the heat of his touch seep through the thin fabric of her gown, and for a brief moment, she wanted to pull away, to escape the overwhelming pressure of his presence. But she didn't. She couldn't. The Duke, in that moment, was everything. And yet, in some strange, twisted way, Eleanor realized that she wasn't afraid of him. Not in the way she should have been. He was power incarnate, a man who could make or break her with a single word. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing beside him not because of her own strength, but because of his. It was the way he held her, as though she were something fragile, something to be protected, but also something to be controlled. The crowd around them shifted, their hushed whispers growing louder, their curiosity turning to something more. Eleanor could feel their stares, the weight of their judgments pressing against her, but it was the Duke's presence that shielded her from it all. She wasn't sure what he saw in her, why he had chosen her, but at that moment, it didn't matter. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer nothing. She was his. And in this world, that meant everything. The Duke's grip tightened slightly, just enough for her to feel the shift in the air, the change in the room. She felt the power in his touch, in his gaze, and it was all-consuming. He had marked her, and the entire ballroom had seen it. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She could feel the weight of their gazes, but now, it was her turn to hold the room's attention. The Duke leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her ear, his voice low and commanding. "You belong here now," he said, his words so quiet, yet so firm that she had no choice but to believe them. "You are mine." His words were not a question. They were a declaration. And though she wanted to speak, to protest, to ask him why, she couldn't. There was a power in his silence, in the way he controlled the room, in the way he controlled her. She wanted to look away, to find some comfort in the eyes of the guests, to retreat to her old life, where she had been invisible, but she couldn't. She couldn't because the Duke had taken that choice from her. And in that moment, Eleanor realized something she hadn't before. She wasn't just standing by his side. She was standing with him. She had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. The tension in the room was unbearable now. The whispers had stopped, but their judgment remained. The Duke's eyes flicked over the crowd, as though daring anyone to challenge his decision. They didn't. They wouldn't. The power he wielded was unassailable. And Eleanor, for the first time in her life, felt it too. She was no longer just a pawn in the game. She was part of the play now, and she had no idea where it would lead. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The weight of the room's gaze pressed against Eleanor as the Duke led her further into the heart of the ballroom. She could feel the heat of their stares, the whispers barely contained by the hushed murmurs of the crowd. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each step forward making her feel more exposed, more fragile, as if every person in the room were waiting for her to break. The Duke, however, seemed unbothered by the eyes that followed them. His movements were deliberate, smooth, as if he owned the room, and in that moment, it felt as though he did. Eleanor's heartbeat echoed in her ears, her nerves stretched thin. He had chosen her, and yet, the weight of his gaze felt like 1,000 questions she couldn't answer. What did he expect of her? Why had he chosen her? She wasn't sure she could handle it, but she couldn't escape it either. The tension between them was unbearable. She was aware of every inch of space between them, the way his fingers brushed against her skin, the pressure of his hand as it remained firm on her back. His touch was a constant reminder of his power, of his control over the situation and over her. She wanted to speak, to ask him why, but the words stuck in her throat, choked by the fear of what his response might be. She had always been invisible, never more than a quiet shadow in the background. Yet here she was, standing beside a man who commanded the room with nothing more than his presence. He had marked her, claimed her in a way she couldn't quite understand. But what did that mean? The guests around them seemed to move in slow motion, the air thick with their judgment. She could hear their murmurs, their gasps, but she couldn't focus on them. All that mattered was the Duke. His gaze never wavered as he led her to the center of the ballroom. He stopped, and she followed, standing motionless as he turned to face her. His eyes locked onto hers, cold, calculating, as if he were trying to read her, trying to understand what made her tick. "You still don't understand, do you?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried enough weight to make her stomach churn. Eleanor couldn't respond, couldn't bring herself to speak. What could she say? Herself. The Duke's expression softened for just a moment, but it was fleeting. This world is unforgiving, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. And yet, you will have to find a way to navigate it. The words stung, but they were also a challenge. Eleanor could feel the weight of them settle deep in her chest, the pressure building, until she felt like she might burst. She wanted to scream, to break free of this moment, but she couldn't. Not when the Duke was standing there, watching her, waiting for her to respond. She wanted to ask him why he was doing this to her, why he had chosen her, but the answer was too elusive, too tangled in the complexities of the moment. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. She could feel the electricity between them, the pull of his presence, his power, and it made her heart race. And yet, it also terrified her. The Duke took a step closer, the air around them growing thicker, more charged. His breath was steady, his hand brushing against her arm once again. But this time, the touch felt different, more intimate, more commanding. Eleanor's body stiffened, her nerves on edge as she fought the urge to step back, to pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't. He had chosen her, and in that moment, that knowledge settled deep within her, a truth she couldn't ignore. The power dynamic had shifted. There was no going back. He had claimed her, and the world would never see her the same way again. The ballroom seemed to disappear around them, the noise of the guests fading into the background. It was as though the two of them were alone, trapped in this moment, this tension-filled space between them. The Duke's eyes burned with intensity, his lips barely moving as he spoke again. "You are mine now, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but unmistakable. "And the world will know it." The words hung in the air like a declaration, a promise that left her breathless. She didn't know what this meant, what he expected from her, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer a shadow. She was a part of something much larger now, and the power of that realization sent a shiver down her spine. The tension between them had reached its peak, and Eleanor could feel it, could feel the shift in the room, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She was bound to this moment, bound to him. And in that binding, something inside her began to change. She didn't know what it was yet, but it was there, growing, shifting, taking root deep within her. The Duke's hand rested on her shoulder, firm, possessive, as he turned toward the crowd. The whispers had started again, louder now, more insistent, but Eleanor didn't hear them. All she could hear was the steady beat of her own heart, the rush of blood in her ears, and the unmistakable feeling of the Duke's presence beside her. She had been chosen, and there was no going back. The ballroom was a sea of eyes, all focused on Eleanor, and yet, it was as if the entire room had ceased to exist, swallowed up by the storm of emotions surging between her and the Duke. His presence was suffocating, but it was also intoxicating. She could feel the pull of his power, the unyielding force that shaped every moment, every breath. The Duke had claimed her, and the room had witnessed it, but now, as he stood so close, his breath brushing against her ear, she felt the weight of the tension more than ever. Every inch of space between them felt charged, as if the slightest movement could set it all off. The whispers from the crowd had grown louder, more insistent, but Eleanor couldn't hear them. She could only hear the steady beat of her own heart, the rush of blood in her veins. The Duke's hand rested lightly on her waist, his fingers cool against her skin, and yet the pressure of his touch seemed to burn right through her. "You've never understood your worth, have you?" The Duke's voice was a low murmur, but it carried the weight of 1,000 decisions. His words hit her like a slap, but there was something else in them, something she couldn't name, something that pulled at the very core of her being. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the force of the emotion swirling around them. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between them felt unbearable, like a pressure that threatened to crush her. The Duke's eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something deeper in them, something that made her feel as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of a future she couldn't predict. His fingers tightened around her waist, and the movement sent a shockwave of energy through her. For the first time, She felt controlled, not by her own fear, but by the Duke's presence, his will. She wasn't sure whether she hated it or needed it. The room seemed to contract around them, the space between them growing smaller with each passing second. She wanted to escape, to run, to slip away from the weight of his gaze, but she couldn't. She was trapped in this moment, in this power dynamic, caught between fear and something else, something that stirred deep within her. She tried to look away, but the Duke's hand slid up her arm, the touch almost tender, and yet, somehow, it felt like a claim. His thumb brushed against her skin, and for a moment, she thought she might lose her composure completely. His touch was light, but it was there, a reminder of his control over her. The world outside them faded into a blur as the Duke took a small step closer, his breath warm against her cheek. Eleanor could feel the tension building, a thick, suffocating pressure that wrapped around her chest and tightened with each passing second. The Duke had pushed her into a corner, physically and emotionally, and she wasn't sure if she could bear it much longer. He was still silent, still studying her with that unreadable expression, but the weight of his gaze felt like 1,000 questions she couldn't answer. She wanted to speak, to ask him why, to demand an explanation for his actions, but the words wouldn't come. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he could sense her hesitation, her confusion. He stepped back, pulling her gently but firmly along with him, and the movement broke the spell for just a moment. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but it shifted. The guests, who had been watching in rapt attention, began to murmur once again, their voices rising in an ever-increasing swell of curiosity and judgment. Eleanor's chest tightened at the sound of their whispers. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, could feel their eyes searching her, trying to understand what had just happened. But the Duke wasn't interested in their scrutiny. He was interested in her. And in that moment, Eleanor realized something that made her heart stop. He wasn't just choosing her. He was shaping her. His hand tightened slightly on her wrist as he pulled her forward again, his steps purposeful, steady, and Eleanor followed, as if she had no other choice. The world around them seemed to fade away, as though she were moving through a tunnel of sound, and the only thing that mattered was the Duke and the power that radiated from him. The shift in the air was almost palpable, the moment teetering on the edge of something monumental. Eleanor could feel it, the weight of his decision, the gravity of what had just happened. She had been chosen, but at what cost? She wasn't sure anymore. The Duke led her toward a small balcony, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. But even in this secluded space, the tension was palpable. He turned to face her, his eyes never leaving hers. She could feel the power in his gaze, the force of it pulling her in. "You've always been invisible," he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "But now, you will learn to live in this world." Eleanor didn't know what to say. Her heart raced, her thoughts spinning, but one thing was clear. The Duke had not just chosen her. He had set something in motion, something that would change everything. He wasn't just pulling her into his world, he was shaping it. And she was standing at the center of it, unsure whether she was ready or not. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that it didn't matter. The power had already shifted, and there was no going back. The Duke's hand, once a firm yet reassuring presence on her wrist, suddenly shifted. Eleanor's body stiffened, the shock of his movement rippling through her. He pulled her closer, the force of it sudden, compelling. Her breath caught, as his arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her into his chest. The proximity was overwhelming, her body pressed against his, and for a fleeting moment, she felt as though she might collapse under the weight of his presence. The Duke's face was mere inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and intense, but now, something else flickered in them, something deeper, darker. "You think you understand your place." The Duke's voice was low, but each word felt like a lash. Eleanor's heart raced, but she couldn't speak. The words she wanted to say caught in her throat, suffocated by the intensity of the moment. His grip tightened slightly, just enough to make her skin burn, and for a moment, it felt like the room had stopped spinning. The tension between them was thick enough to touch. The crowd around them seemed to fade into the distance. All that mattered was the Duke's grip on her, the unspoken promise in his eyes, and the heavy weight of the secret he was about to reveal. "You think you've been chosen," he continued, his voice colder now. But you've misunderstood everything. Eleanor's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. She tried to pull away, but his hold on her was unyielding, his strength evident in the way he held her against him. The room felt smaller now, suffocating in the quiet that surrounded them. The world seemed to shrink into this moment, this confession that was yet to be spoken. She felt the room hold its breath, the tension in the air so thick it was almost tangible. The Duke's grip softened for just a moment, and Eleanor could have sworn she saw something akin to regret in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same cold calculation that she had come to know so well. He stepped back slightly, but only enough to look at her fully. "You were never the one I wanted," he said, and his words cut deeper than any blade could. Eleanor's heart seemed to stop, her world tilting dangerously beneath her. The revelation hit her like a thunderclap, shattering everything she thought she knew. "What?" she managed to whisper, the word a fragile thread in the storm that had engulfed her. The Duke's gaze never faltered as he stepped back further, his posture unchanged, his control over the situation absolute. "I've been watching you, yes, but not for the reasons you think. You are merely a tool in a larger game, a piece in a puzzle I've been putting together for years." Eleanor could feel the blood drain from her face as she struggled to process his words. He didn't want her. She had been chosen, but it was all a lie. She had thought she had power, that she had been swept into a world of privilege, but she was nothing more than a pawn in his strategy. The realization hit her like a wave, overwhelming her, suffocating her. The Duke's eyes softened again, but this time, there was no tenderness in them, only a cold indifference. "I never wanted you," he repeated, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. "But you were the perfect distraction." Eleanor's legs felt weak beneath her, and she had to fight to remain standing. She had been a distraction, a diversion in a game she hadn't even known she was part of. The world around her felt like it was collapsing, but the Duke stood unmoving, unshaken. Her gaze flickered to the crowd, to the guests who had been watching, waiting, but there was no comfort there, no ally to turn to. They were all spectators in a game that had long since been decided. Eleanor's heart raced as the full weight of his words settled on her. She had been chosen, yes, but for reasons that had nothing to do with her. She had been nothing more than a piece of the Duke's intricate plan. And now, she had no place in it. The realization that she was nothing more than a tool hit her like a crushing blow, but she wasn't done yet. There was still a part of her that refused to believe it, a part of her that screamed for her to take control, to fight back. But as she looked up at the Duke, she saw the truth in his eyes. There was no fighting him, no winning in this game. She had lost before she had even known the rules. The tension in the air thickened, the finality of the Duke's words hanging in the silence between them. Eleanor felt the heat of his gaze on her, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of something else, something that could almost be regret. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculating expression she had come to know so well. "You were always meant to fail," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "And now, we both move on." With that, the Duke turned on his heel, his cape sweeping behind him as he strode away, leaving Eleanor standing there, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The crowd shifted, but Eleanor didn't notice them. She could barely hear the murmurs that followed the Duke's departure. All she could hear was the deafening silence in her own mind, the roar of confusion, betrayal, and loss. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was left standing in the ruins of what she thought was a new beginning. She had been chosen, yes, but she had been chosen for the wrong reasons. And now, she had nothing. The weight of the truth pressed down on Eleanor like a crushing storm, suffocating her, paralyzing her. The Duke's words echoed in her mind, his revelation cutting through her like a blade. She had been nothing more than a tool, a piece in a larger game, and the realization made her knees feel weak beneath her. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though every ounce of oxygen had been stolen from her. The guests around her faded into the distance, their murmurs and whispers drowned out by the loud, pounding beat of her heart. The ballroom, once so grand, so alive with energy, now felt like a prison, each ornate detail a reminder of the falseness she had walked into. The Duke's betrayal was like a cold wind, biting and relentless. She wanted to run, to escape from the world he had built around her, but she couldn't. She was trapped in his web, bound by his power, by his control. And worst of all, she had allowed herself to believe in him. His grip had been steady, unyielding, and for a moment, she had thought she was a part of something real, something powerful. But now she saw the truth. He had never wanted her. He had never seen her as more than a tool, an instrument to further his own desires. Her chest tightened as the bitter taste of humiliation flooded her mouth. The room spun around her, her legs unsteady, but she couldn't move. Her gaze was locked on the Duke, who stood at the center of the ballroom, a figure of cold authority. He had turned his back on her, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might shatter into a million pieces. She had been so sure, so certain that she had found something in him, something that had given her purpose. But now, she saw it for what it was, nothing more than a lie. The Duke wasn't finished with her yet. He didn't leave. He didn't turn away. Instead, he came closer, his steps deliberate, his eyes never leaving her. The room seemed to hold its breath as he approached, the tension building with each step. His presence, once so commanding, now felt like a storm that could tear everything apart. Eleanor wanted to speak, to confront him, to demand answers, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the overwhelming weight of his presence. When he reached her, the Duke didn't touch her, not yet. His eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in them, a glimmer of something Eleanor couldn't quite understand. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold, calculating gaze that had made her feel like nothing more than a pawn. "You are nothing more than a distraction," the Duke said, his voice quiet but filled with a sharp edge. The words stung, cutting deeper than anything he had said before. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat, her hands trembling as she fought to hold herself together. She wanted to scream, to demand that he take back everything he had just said, but the words wouldn't come. The Duke's eyes bored into hers, as though searching for something, some sign of weakness. "You've been a part of my plan from the start," he continued, his voice colder now, every word calculated. "You've played your role, and now it's time for you to leave." Eleanor could feel her chest tighten with every word, the reality of what he had just said crashing down on her. She was nothing. She had been nothing all along. The room around her felt as though it were closing in, the walls pressing in on her with an almost suffocating force. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. She was frozen, trapped in a moment she could not escape. The Duke stepped back, his gaze still on her, his posture stiff, his control unbroken. "You will leave," he said, each word final, like a sentence. The power had shifted again, and this time, there was no going back. The Duke had taken everything from her, her pride, her dignity, and the hope she had once held in her heart. She was nothing now, but even as the crushing weight of his words settled over her, a spark of defiance flickered within her. Eleanor lifted her chin, a slight tremor running through her, but she held his gaze. She would not break. Not now. Not ever. She had been cast aside, discarded like a piece of refuse, but the fire inside her refused to die. She may have been nothing in his eyes, but she was something else entirely in her own. The Duke's words had ripped away her illusions, shattered the fragile world she had built around him, but in the ruins of that world, something stronger began to form. She could feel it, a shift inside her, a change that she had never anticipated. She was no longer the passive observer, no longer the invisible noblewoman standing on the sidelines. She was someone else now, and though the Duke may have thought he had broken her, he had only pushed her closer to the truth of who she was meant to be. Eleanor straightened her back, her eyes burning with a quiet fire, as she prepared to face whatever came next. The power had shifted, yes, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was only the beginning. The Duke's cold eyes met Eleanor's once again, but this time, there was no mistaking the shift in the air between them. She had stood in the shadow of his power for so long, had been the invisible figure in his world, but now, as she met his gaze, something had changed. The power he had held over her, his dominance, his control, was still there, but it no longer defined her. The weight of the past moments hung between them, the tension thick in the air, but there was no going back. Eleanor had felt it before, the crushing sense of being a pawn, a piece in a game where she had no place. But now, as the Duke's gaze softened, she could feel the power in her own body, in her own heart. She had been broken, yes, but she had also been rebuilt, and the truth of who she was had finally settled into her bones. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, but now there was a strength in her that hadn't been there before. The Duke was still the force that drove the room, that controlled everything around them, but she was no longer afraid. She wasn't weak anymore. She wasn't invisible. She was seen, and more importantly, she was heard. The Duke stepped forward, his hand outstretched as if to claim her once again, but Eleanor didn't flinch. Her body remained still, her gaze never wavering. She didn't need to shrink away from him anymore. She had been chosen, yes, but it wasn't the way she had imagined. It wasn't the way he had wanted. His fingers brushed against her arm, the touch light, but the air between them shifted. She could feel his control, still there, but it wasn't the same. His power over her was no longer absolute. The room felt different now, still filled with the hum of curiosity, of judgment, but somehow quieter, as though the guests were no longer as important as they had once seemed. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, but it didn't matter anymore. The Duke's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her closer, but she didn't move. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, and for the first time, Eleanor could feel herself breathing. "You think you've won," the Duke said, his voice low and cutting through the silence. Eleanor didn't respond, but she felt the words in her chest, felt the truth of them. She hadn't won, not yet, but she had changed. This game was never about winning, she replied, her voice steady, strong. The Duke's eyes narrowed, as though he hadn't expected her to speak, much less stand her ground. For a moment, neither of them moved, the tension building between them, until the room seemed to freeze. The Duke's hand remained on her arm, but his grip loosened, and that small shift, subtle but undeniable, was enough. She could feel the power shift, the invisible thread that had once bound her to him beginning to unravel. He was still the Duke, still powerful, still commanding, but now, so was she. Eleanor took a step back, out of his reach, the movement simple but defiant. Her heart raced, but it wasn't fear that fueled her anymore. It was the steady, unyielding knowledge that she was more than the role he had cast her in. "You've been using me," she said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "But you didn't see me. Not truly. Not until now." The Duke stared at her, his expression unreadable. His lips parted as though to say something, but the words never came. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving hers. The weight of the past, of the power he had over her, hung between them, but now it was different. The power had shifted, and in that silence, Eleanor could feel the world around them settle into place. She was no longer just the noblewoman who had been chosen, discarded, and used. She was someone who had chosen herself. The Duke moved closer, his body towering over hers, his presence still overwhelming. His hand reached out once more, but this time, Eleanor didn't retreat. She stood her ground, the tension between them palpable, but she didn't flinch. The air was electric, thick with the remnants of everything that had come before, but it was not the same as it had been. The Duke's eyes softened, just slightly, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something different in them. Not pity, not disdain, but something close to respect. "You're stronger than I thought," he said, his voice low. Eleanor didn't respond, but she didn't need to. His words were a shift, a moment of realization, but they didn't change the truth. She had already won. Not over him, not over the world, but over the version of herself that had been broken, silenced, and controlled. And as the Duke's gaze lingered on her, something in the room, something in both of them, shifted completely. The tension had reached its peak, but Eleanor stood, unmoving, no longer a pawn in a game that had never been hers to win. The power had shifted, and the world would never be the same. The Duke stood in front of her, the weight of his presence so overwhelming that, for a moment, Eleanor thought she might lose herself in it. His gaze, once cold and indifferent, now seemed to carry the heavy burden of everything that had passed between them, everything that had led to this moment. She had felt his power, his control, but now, in the silence that stretched between them, there was something else, something that had shifted irrevocably. She stood tall, unwavering, her breath steady in her chest. The power had truly shifted. The ballroom around them seemed to fade into the background, as if the world had paused just for them. The Duke, for all his authority, for all his coldness, was now a man whose words had lost their bite. Eleanor had claimed her own strength. She was no longer the woman who had cowered in the shadows of his world. She was no longer the invisible noblewoman who had been cast aside. She was the woman who had survived his games, who had risen from the ashes of his betrayal, and who now stood before him with a power all her own. The Duke's gaze flickered slightly, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something in his eyes, a fleeting moment of uncertainty. It was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of control. But she had seen it. She had felt it. The power that had once been so firmly in his grasp was now slipping through his fingers. His hand, still resting lightly on her arm, twitched slightly, but Eleanor didn't flinch. His touch, once a reminder of his dominance, now felt different. It felt like an echo of the past, a ghost of the man who had tried to control her. And in that moment, she realized the truth. It was no longer him who held the power. It was her. The Duke stepped back, his gaze never leaving hers. The room around them seemed to exhale, the tension that had been building between them slowly dissipating. But Eleanor didn't look away. She didn't need to. "You've won," the Duke said, his voice quieter now, the weight of the words heavier than they had ever been. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The words, once so impossible to imagine, now felt like a release, a moment of closure. The Duke had said it. He had acknowledged it. She had won. Not over him. Not over the world. But over herself. Over the version of herself who had been broken, who had been controlled, who had thought she was nothing. She was something now. She was strong. The room began to move again, the noise returning to its normal hum. But Eleanor stood still, anchored by the strength she had found in herself. The Duke turned, his back to her now, and for a brief moment, she saw him differently. He was not the powerful, untouchable figure he had once been. He was a man who had been undone by his own choices. She could feel the weight of the power he had once held over her slipping away with each passing second. But it wasn't over. There was still something between them, something that had been left unsaid, something that would linger long after the evening ended. As the Duke turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the grand hall, Eleanor took a single step forward, her gaze never leaving him. She wasn't going to chase him. She wasn't going to beg for his attention, for his approval. She had earned her place, not through his choosing, but through her own strength. The crowd began to stir, their gazes flicking between her and the Duke, but Eleanor didn't care. The eyes that had once judged her, that had looked down upon her, were now irrelevant. She was no longer the woman who had been invisible. She was the woman who had made herself known. The Duke paused at the door,